Hey everyone. All right, let's continue on to chapter 14 in the book of Genesis. And chapter 14 in the book of Genesis talks about how Abram rescues Lot and meets Melchizedek. And the first section of chapter 14 talks about how Abram rescues Lot from Chedorlaomer. If I said that right, I may not have. And the alliance of 4 kings. So let's start with the first four verses. I'm so sorry, I cannot speak for the life of me tonight. And verse 1 through 4 talks about the rebellion of the 5 kings. And 1 through 4 says, "And it came to pass in the days of," I'm going to try to pronounce it the best I can, guys, I'm sorry. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zor. All of these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. Siddim? Siddim. The vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year, they rebelled. All right, so there was 5 kings. Amraphel, which is the king of Shinar, Arioch, which is I think it's Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of nations. Okay, those 4 kings made war with the other 5 kings, which is Bera, the king of Sodom, Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinab, the king of Admah, Shemember, the king of Zeboim, and Zor, the king of Bela. And all of these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. And let's go on to verse 5 through 7. And 5 through 7 talks about the attacks against many tribes. So 5 through 7 says, "And in the 14th year," now mind you, and they joined together and fought in the 13th year. Then in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, which is Amraphel, Arioch, and Tidal, and smote the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shavah Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir into El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazezon Tamar. I am so sorry that I butchered, I'm pretty sure, every name, but that was the best I could do. So in verse 5, where it says Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked. So the people who lived in Canaan in the days of Abram were like humanity in general, okay? And there were many among them that were interested in conquest and domination. And this confederation of kings who rebelled against Chedorlaomer wanted to be free from his dominion. Now note that in the 14th year that they came with Chedorlaomer came with the kings with him and smote the other 5. And in verse 7, they returned and came to En-Meshep, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites and all of the Amorites that dwelt in the Hazazon Tamar. All right, so 8 through 10 is the next verses is 8 through 10. And 8 through 10 talks about the group of 5 kings joins the battle. And 8 through 10 says, "And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and Zeboim, and the king of Bela," the same is Zor, "and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer the king of Elam, and with Tidal king of nations, and Amraphel king of Shinar, and Arioch king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And verse 10, "And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain." So, and the vale of Siddim, Siddim, was full of slime pits. So the Salt Sea was full of slime pits, which is basically like asphalt pits. And there were fearful asphalt pits in that region, and some fell there because of the asphalt pits. 11. Okay, next we're going on to verse 11 and verse 12. And that is the alliance of 4 kings takes Lot and all of his possessions. 11 and 12 says, "And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." So they took Lot. And because Lot was Abram's brother's son, the group of 4 kings involved Abram. He was a man of honor and a guardian of his family. And they even took his goods. So, since Lot lived among the wicked people of Sodom, we're not surprised he was also taken and held captive. All right, the next 2 verses is 13 and 14. And 13 and 14 is about how Abram learns of Lot's captivity and he gathers an army. So 13 and 14 says, "And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan." So, in verse 13, where it says Abram the Hebrew, so this is the first use of the term Hebrew in the Bible. Abram came from beyond the Euphrates River and had passed over the river to Canaan. The word Hebrew comes from a root word that means passed over. And in verse 14, where it says he armed his 318 trained servants. So any man who could assemble 318 servants capable of fighting Must be very wealthy, because that's a lot of servants. Then you have the trained servants. Abram walked in faith, but he was a prudent man. He kept his own personal army. And that was okay, because God was watching over them. And when it says, and went into pursuit unto Dan. So Abram's army pursued the 4 kings a long distance to the north. And the city of Dan is not far from the northern border of Israel. All right, next is verse 15 through 17. And these 3 verses talks about how Abram leads his army to victory over the alliance of the 4 kings. So 15 through 17 says, and he divided himself against them, and he and his servants by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shavah, which is the king's dale. All right, so in verse 15, when it says he divided his forces against them by night. So this goes to show that Abram had military wisdom. Using night attack with his army split into 2 groups. Rescuing Lot and all of the plunder, which is the goods, seized by the 4 kings. He got it all back. Because he pursued them into Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And in verse 16, where it says, brought back his nephew Lot and his goods. So unfortunately, Lot moved right back to where he was before in Sodom. He refused this warning from God and would eventually lose everything, because he went back after this. You know, the account of Abram's rescue of Lot is an analogy of a believer's salvation. Okay. God's chosen was captured, and they were captured in sin and shame, and was rescued by one who left his safety and his happiness. You know, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of his people, went to great trouble and distance, and with courage and daring defeated the mighty enemy, and he set his people free, and he took all the enemy's spoil. All right, so the next section is about Abram and Melchizedek. I can't, hold on just a second. I always forget how to pronounce that, but I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. Melchizedek. Hold on. Melchizedek. That's how you pronounce it. Melchizedek. All right, so 18, 19, and 20 verses is talks about how Abram meets Melchizedek. So 18, 19, and 20, let's read that. Verse 18 starts out saying, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Okay, so 18, 19, and 20. So Melchizedek. So we don't know where he came from, how he came to be in Canaan, or how he became a worshiper and priest of the true God. and how Abram came to know about him. You know, we only know that he was there. We know that he was the king of Salem. And his name, Melchizedek, means king of righteousness. He was the king of Salem, and Salem was the original Jerusalem, and he was the priest of God's Most High, ruling over Jerusalem even in those ancient times. And in Corinthians chapter 26, verse 16 through 23, says that King Uzziah tried to do work of a priest, and God struck him with leprosy. But Melchizedek was the exception. And when he brought out bread and wine, you know, when he served Abram bread and wine, possibly looking forward to our redeeming sacrifices, the bread and wine of Passover, and the Lord's table of redeeming sacrifice, Jesus Christ. When it says he was the priest of the Most High God. So Melchizedek did two things. He blessed Abram and he blessed God. And you can also reference that in Psalms chapter 110 verse 4 and the book of Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3. And in verse 20 where it says he gave him a tithe of all, Abram gave unto the Lord, and he did it through giving to Melchizedek, a tithe of all, meaning 1/10, which is your tithes, meaning 1/10 of his assets, not his income. So then we go on to verse 20. Verse 21 through 24 talks about how Abram refuses the plunder from the battle. So 21 through 24 says, and this is also the last 4 verses in the chapter 15. 21, and the king of Sodom said unto Abram, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. I can never say that word. Mamre. Let them take their portion. So, come here. Get back here. So, in verse 21, where it says, take the goods for yourself. So, as seemed proper, the king of Sodom wanted to reward Abram for all he did in recovering what was taken by the partnership of the 4 kings, and he offered Abram a huge amount of plunder. But in verse 23, where it says, I will take nothing, you know, after he offered him a huge amount of plunder, but yet Abram would not take any of the plunder, the spoil taken from Sodom and Gomorrah and recovered. This was because of the vow that he had made to God. The phrase, I have raised my hand to the Lord, indicates that Abram made that vow with God. And also in verse 23, when it says, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, Abram refused any portion of the plunder because he would not allow anyone say that a man had made Abram rich. Abram determined that all of the credit should go to God and God alone. And in verse 24, the last verse of the chapter, where it says, let them take their portion. However, at the same time, Abram did not impose his principles on his Amorite allies, you know, which was in chapter 14, verse 13 in Genesis. They were entitled to as much of the spoil as was appropriate under the customs of the time. So, looking back, before we end this video, what I say was Melchizedek. I had a couple of notes. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, so one thing that makes Melchizedek unique was that he was both a king and a priest. But if you look at history, it shows that it is often dangerous to combine religious and civic authority. You know, God forbade that kings of Israel to be priests and the priests to be kings. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 16 through 23, King Uzziah tried to do the work of a priest, and God struck him down with leprosy. You know, and that's why I said Melchizedek was an exception. And even though Melchizedek seemed like an obscure figure, he is in fact an important Old Testament person. In Psalms 110 verse 4, like I said, you can reference that. It says the priesthood of the Messiah will be a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, in contrast to the order of Aaron. The attention given this idea in Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7 shows this is an important idea. And in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3 describes that Melchizedek as without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor the end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. So because of this passage, some have thought that Melchizedek was a pre-Bethlehem appearance of Jesus. But others have suggested he was Seth, which was Noah's son, or Job, or an angel. Or even some have bizarrely speculated that Melchizedek was an outer space visitor or an unfallen Adam from another planet sent to observe the progress of God's work of redemption for this fallen race. But these suggestions have no biblical foundation whatsoever. But Hebrews 7 verse 3 does explain how he was without a father, a mother, without genealogy, but it doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It's just not in records that we see. Back when he said he gave him a tithe of all, Abram gave to the Lord, and he did it through giving to Melchizedek a tithe of all. This referred to 1/10 of his assets, not his income, which is a remarkably generous gift. So it was almost as if Abram and Melchizedek worked to see who could bless the other more. Melchizedek blessed Abram out of his resources, and Abram blessed Melchizedek out of his resources. This is a wonderful attitude in a community of believers, an attitude of mutual blessing. Also in the covenant God later made with Israel, a tithe was commanded. Abram's giving to Melchizedek a tithe of all shows that the principle of the tithe predates the old covenant and is not restricted to the law of Moses. Under the new covenant, the tithe is not emphasized, yet on the idea of proportional giving is clearly stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 2, and 1/10 may be regarded as a goal or measure of that proportion. In the covenant God later made with Israel, a tithe was commanded. You can find that in Leviticus chapter 27 verse 30 through 33, Numbers chapter 18 verse 21 through 24, and Deuteronomy chapter 26 verse 12 through 15. Excuse me. All right, guys, thank you. We are all finished with chapter 14.